Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and giving your time to this webinar this morning. Really appreciate it. And we have with us two amazing speakers joining us here today. We've got Colette, who almost pretty much needs no introduction to this community, is how I like to see it. And we've got our principal product manager, Beth, who is the force behind our risk assessments feature that has recently launched the market. So they'll both be speaking a lot more than me, but you'll have to suffer me briefly while I just get through some introductions and some housekeeping. So I am Arun Ramadas, Director of Marketing at Legl, and your host today. So I'll do my best to try and navigate this for all of us. And before we dive into the topic, we're here today to talk about risk assessments, talking about why it might be important to rethink risk assessments. How do you move from that compliance to confidence as a firm? It's a hot topic today. So Beth has been spending a lot of time with a lot of our customers and your peers in the market, learning about what's going on. And she has a lot of insights to share from that experience. And Colette, of course, has spent a lot of time in this industry, both on the regulator side and now more recently supporting law firms, and is a wealth of knowledge and insight in the space. So we'll be trying to unpick with her why this is important today, what's changing, what should law firms be thinking about. So we're going to dive into all of that in a minute. Just a couple of housekeeping items before that. For those of we've got quite a large group of people joining us today. So we haven't enabled webcam and voice for everyone. That can be a little bit messy, but we would love for you to participate. So to participate, look at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully you can find the Q&A button. So please use that and use that a lot. We'd love to hear what you're curious about, what questions you have. I'll do my best to pick up those questions as we go through the discussion where it fits. And if anything gets left over, I will ensure I'll try and field that to Beth and Colette towards the end of this call. I think there is a chat functionality. You're welcome to use that, but try and avoid posting questions there because sometimes it gets really busy and I might miss your questions. So please use the Q&A for questions, but feel free to participate where the chat functionality is available. And another way we'd love to hear from you is we've got a few poll questions lined up for you. So those will be popping up from time to time on your screen. I will introduce them. So please do click and respond. We'd love to learn more about you and incorporate some of your views going into this discussion as well. So watch out for that. And final bit of housekeeping, we are recording the session, so we'll make the recording available after. So hopefully that means you can sit back, listen in, enjoy the discussions rather than have to worry about taking notes. And you can always come back and check out some of the things we talked about if you want to do that later. Okay, without further ado, let's dive in. I'd love to kick off with introductions. I've got a raised hand. So if there's anything we can help with, please pop it in the Q&A. That'll be the easiest way we can pick up and respond. I do have my colleague, Fran, in the background who's trying to monitor if people are having any technical issues. So we'll try and pick up any questions that way. Okay. As I said, without further ado, we will dive in with some introductions. And Colette, I would love to start with you. If you wouldn't mind coming on and introducing yourself very briefly. And also, we've got a opening question for you, which is, if you could go back and whisper one piece of advice in the year of your former SRA self, knowing what you know now from working with firms, what would that be?
Thanks, Erin. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak, and thanks so much to the legal team for inviting me. So as Erin says, I'm Colette Best. I'm currently Director of Anti-Money Laundering at Kingsley Napley. So I offer services to law firms. Up until about a year or so ago, I was Director of Anti-Money Laundering at the Solicitors Regulation Authority. I held that role for about 5 years, and I was at the SRA for a total of 9 years. But prior to that, I've spent lots of time with different industries working in anti-money laundering. and it's a great question from you, Aaron. I'm not sure it's a piece of advice per se, but I think the thing that I would like to have given myself was just an understanding, which I have now, of what it is to be a fee earner in a law firm, the pressures that go with that, the joy that is time recording, and actually the perspective that that gives you on anti-money laundering compliance, because I think it does give you a different perspective when you're focused on, you know, treating clients well, but also getting files open and getting on with matters.
Amazing. Thanks, Colette. And let's pass this over to you, Beth. If you could do the same, come on and introduce yourself. And the question I have for you to kick things off is, having spent time recently speaking to law firms about risk assessment, what's the most surprising thing you've learned from that experience and process?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Arun. And thank you everyone for joining. It's amazing to see such a huge number of people on this call. I'm Beth Colquhoun. I'm a Principal Product Manager here at Legl, working on our new risk assessments module in co-development with our law firm customers. I've had the pleasure of working at Legl for a year now, coming up to a year. And I have a background in building products for regulated industries, so typically health and social care, alongside, of course, the legal sector as well. The tools that I've been focused on have largely been around supporting firms to manage risk and increase compliance and just improve the sort of experience for teams and end clients as well. In terms of the biggest surprise that I have learned about having spoken to our customers about risk assessments, I think the thing that stands out for me so much is the amount of time that is being invested and put into ensuring that risk assessments are being done as they should be. And that means, are they being completed at all? Are they actually complete? Are all of their questions being answered consistently? Are they being completed to a high standard? And what has been completed, does that align to our policies? Whether that's hiring additional staff to support with that job, or time being taken from people that could perhaps be better spent elsewhere. That's the main thing that has really sort of come through from the conversations that we've been having in the last weeks and months.
Yeah, and that's a significant impact, right? When you think about regulatory changes that eventually then precipitate work that sometimes involves even hiring additional resource, stretching your already stretched business support of functional operations. That's massive impact on firms. So that's a great way to just set us up going into the next section. But before that, as Beth mentioned, it's wonderful to see so many people on the call. And what we'd love to do is get a quick sense check of who we do have on the call. So we'd love to hear from you. And this is a way to warm us up. Because we've got a big mix of audience here, who are you primarily regulated by, or your firm? Great. I'm seeing responses come in. So let's give everyone a few seconds to respond, and I will share the results shortly. Almost there. Last few. Great. Okay, let's end this poll and let's share results. There we are. So we are mainly joined by firms that are regulated by the SRA. We've got a few here that are Scottish and Irish, regulated by Scottish and Irish authorities as well. That's great to see. Thank you very much. So Colette, just diving into this, and we're getting to the conversation we are here to have, which is around risk assessments. I'd love to start by just setting the scene a little bit with you. And you spent a lot of time with SRA. You also now you've seen how compliance evolved firsthand. You've been working really closely with law firms more recently as well on the other side. And why are risk assessments under so much increased scrutiny now? What's making this such a hot topic? Would you set the scene for us before we dive into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think my feeling is that it is just such a rapidly changing landscape at the moment. I mean, I've worked in this area since the third money laundering directive back in 2007. And we had sort of maybe 10 years or so of quite static legislation. But since and I still refer to them as the new regulations came into force in 2017, we've just seen such rapid changes. And of course, 2017 was when the requirement for client matter risk assessments was introduced. So I think it's a fair question why the increased importance on them lately when they've been in force since 2017. And I think a lot of that stems from the issues we were seeing back when I was at the SRA with firms just not getting this right. And that led to a thematic review into client matter risk assessments. That took place during 2023 and reported back in autumn of 2023. And what that included was a guidance note, a potential template which firms could use, but also a warning notice, which is the SRA's preferred way of indicating that actually enforcement action is coming your way because they've seen issues in this particular area. So it's a very clear way of setting out good and poor practice, what is expected, and signalling an uptick in enforcement. So I think following that, what we have seen is an increase in enforcement action in this area. It's something that the SRA does take really seriously. And if your firm is subject to or has been subject to a desk-based review or an on-site inspection, it's absolutely something that the SRA will consider that as part of that assessment. And of course, as we know, the SRA is again signalling an increase in the number of those on-site inspections and desk-based reviews. So really, it's not so much a matter of if you get one of those, it's a matter of when you get it, and when that takes place, it is something that will absolutely be considered. And if you're not getting this right, could potentially lead to enforcement action.
So that's quite clear. SRA is clearly starting to take more notice of this, coming on the back of its thematic review. So enforcement actions are, I think, if I play that back, you're saying it's not a question of if, it's a when, which sets a backdrop really well. Colette, you mentioned that from the thematic review, it was found that many firms are not getting it right, and it is important for them to get it right. So from a regulator's perspective, with still a bit of your old hat on, what does good look like in a risk assessment process for a modern law firm?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really basic hurdle to get over, which is do you have one for all clients and all matters, and is that documented? Can you find it when either the SRA or when I, as an auditor, come to visit? But I think a lot of firms do find the nuances of this quite difficult. What does good look like? So some of the things that the SRA will look like, or I would look at if I was doing an audit, is, is it there? Is it in place? That's the very basic hurdle. Does it align with your firm-wide risk assessment and with the national risk assessment? So one of the things that you'll quite often see is the firm-wide risk assessment says that conveyancing should always be treated as high risk. But then you've got a matter rated as low or medium risk on a conveyancing transaction, which might be appropriate, but there needs to be justification for that if you're deviating from your firm-wide risk assessment. So that's absolutely something that the regulator will be looking at. Other sort of quite basic requirements is if enhanced due diligence is required, is that something that has been caught through the client and matter risk assessment and treated appropriately. Something that you might see is that there's a PEP owner as part of a transaction, but then the matter has been rated, medium risk, and some of the mandatory enhanced due diligence requirements haven't taken place. That's a really important one. Some other really key things is, has the thinking been set out? Has the thought process been documented? So the SRA will be looking for something that is, considered not a tick box approach where you're ticking, I don't know, low, low, low all the way through, or medium, medium, medium all the way through. It's about setting out the justification and thinking behind it. And finally, the other one I think is that it's reviewed at kind of key stages of a transaction. This might not be sort of quite as appropriate for firms that are doing quite short transactional matters. But if you've got ongoing or long-running client matters, just checking in and making sure that the risk rating is still correct as part of ongoing monitoring. This is the way to document your thinking, document the fact that ongoing monitoring has taken place, and that any changes in risk have been picked up and also documented. So I think those are the key ones from me.
That's really interesting to hear it played out that way, Colette, because I think what comes up for me from that is very often you hear about risk assessment and there's so much focus on the output or the document. But what you're describing to me is pretty much a critical business operation. And that's a very different mindset to kind of saying, I need to produce something versus actually, as a firm, we need to have this business operation in place. And that kind of makes me wonder, of course, risk assessment is critical from a regulatory point of view, but what about beyond just meeting the regulatory requirement? Where have you seen, or do you feel risk assessment kind of as a critical business process add value back to the firm beyond just making the SRA happy?
Yeah, I mean, they is such an important process and document. I mean, I think the two key points that I would make, firstly, sort of proactively, it's really important to inform the level of due diligence that you're doing on the client, and picking up any mandatory due diligence requirements, like I say, for example, with PEPs, politically exposed persons, or high-risk third countries. If you're not doing proper client matter risk assessments, you're risking things being missed and then getting into trouble through not doing mandatory customer due diligence. So sort of on a forward-looking basis, they're really important from that perspective. I think from a sort of retrospective basis, what I tend to say to firms that I'm auditing, imagine worst case scenario. Imagine this transaction, you're 5 years down the road, something has really gone wrong. You've discovered that an unexplained wealth order has been placed on your client, and you're trying to justify the decision making that you took at the time when you onboarded this client and the mitigation that you put in place. And if something like that has happened, the chances are, it's not 2 weeks after the transaction, it's a couple of years down the line. So it's really your way of as a firm of sort of justifying your thinking and setting out so that it can be reconstructed why it was appropriate to act in the way that you did. And we speak a lot about the risk-based approach that the money laundering regulations frame. But what that means is that this isn't a regime that has zero tolerance of failure. It's a regime that says you put your resources where there is the highest risk. And as long as you can justify that approach, that should be defensible. And a really good, really well documented, really robust client matter risk assessment is your way of doing that.
Amazing. So speaking of that business process, time to bring our audience back into this a little bit as well, I think, which is lots of firms manage that process very differently. We understand that some are centralized, some rely on feelers. So here's another poll, which if I can find my polls, I can launch it. Oh, I'm still sharing results. Let's go back. Okay, looks like I launched the wrong poll, but why not? You combine those separate risk assessments. So the results are just coming in. I'm going to let people complete, and then we'll launch the second poll at the same time. Okay, I think the results are in. I'm going to end this poll, and I'm going to launch another poll, which is asking whose responsibility is it to complete risk assessment? So are you centralized? Do you get your fee earners to do it? Is it a more joint or a hybrid approach? And once we have the results in, I'll share this, and we'll move on to talking a little bit more about the process behind this. Okay, results are in. Let's get sharing. This is really interesting. Okay, so looks like majority of firms are getting the fee earners to actually complete the risk assessment. There are a small percentage that are centralized the process, and there are a few that are running it as a joint and a hybrid endeavor. So I'd love to bring Beth into this. Beth, having spoken to a lot of firms recently, as we were looking at how to help firms meet this requirement, what have you seen? How does this poll reflect what you have seen in terms of how they're meeting, how firms are conducting risk assessments, and also what are some of the challenges that they face in that process?
Sure. The results of the poll very much reflect the conversations that we've been having, where the sort of general consensus is that the fee earner will have the best understanding typically of the client, the work that's due to be carried out, and the potential risks carried by both. But with a move towards sort of sharing that process with other members of the team who perhaps are starting to capture information about the client or indeed the matter as part of the client onboarding process. Aside from sort of responsibility to complete, speaking with at least one firm a day at the moment about their risk assessment process, and starting to get some incredibly strong themes around what's going on in practice today. The vast majority are using a document-based approach, so Word or Excel. They've set up their templates. The templates live within a folder. The fee earner makes a copy. They complete the risk assessment. They save it. They download it. They file it. As a best case scenario in this case. And it's really fiddly to fill in a form on Word or Excel. These tools are not necessarily built for that. And those risk assessments are very prone to being saved in a state which is incomplete, and where there may be gaps that you then need to sort of review, go back and follow up on. There's really poor visibility amongst teams as to sort of what the status of a risk assessment is. Generally with document-based approaches, there's no sort of aggregated view of risk for clients and matters. And it's really challenging to maintain version control as well. If you're updating a template based on new regulation, or you're wanting to sort of improve the risk assessment in any way, to version control and disseminate all of that can be a big exercise in itself, particularly when using something like Word or Excel. And also the other kind of key issue we see around this is auditability. When updates need to be made to risk assessments over time, how can you quickly spot that that's happened? How can you quickly understand who made the update, when, and what has actually changed, most importantly, over the journey of that client relationship or matter as well? The alternative that we see is a simple digitized form within the firm's CMS. Some improvement there in user experience for the person completing the form. But again, it's not truly purpose-built to support specifically the risk assessment process. One of the constants I've observed, just to round off this, is across the board, regardless of the method being used, there seems to be a real motivation to increase consistency in how risk is being assessed and to assure alignment between the policies and processes, the firm-wide risk assessment and the client and matter risk assessments, which are happening day to day. Some firms have poured a lot of energy into developing risk rating logic to ensure that risk assessments genuinely align with those policies. And those that haven't, we're seeing a real sort of embracing of the opportunity to do so through more dedicated tools that can do a lot of the heavy lifting here. One of our co-development partners, Helen, who's the practice director at Burnett and Reed, she said really succinctly and sort of helpfully, I think, you can spend all of the time in the world putting together a fantastic risk policy, but at the end of the day, it can be sort of challenging to find the time to cross-check all of that. So how might you be able to actually weave that into your risk assessments to just guarantee that that's carrying through all the way?
That's really interesting, right? Because you invest a lot of time in developing a strong policy and a process, and when the rubber hits the road, often that's the difference between the quality of a policy and what the outcomes are. And Colette, I wonder, what have you seen similarly where law firms are facing friction as they're trying to deploy their policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think Beth makes a really good point about having policies that fee earners are engaged with and trained upon. I think that's a really key point, and having policies and firm-wide risk assessments that feed into client and matter risk assessments, because if the two aren't linked up, then that is a recipe for disaster. I think the other key point which Beth makes, and we've spoken about, is getting fee earners involved. I think it's really hard if you've got a centralised team for them to fully understand the risk present in matters. And I think that goes firstly at the outset of the matter when you're doing your initial client and matter risk assessment, but also on an ongoing basis, because if the risk profile changes of a matter, it's most likely to be the fee earners working on that are going to spot it. There are obviously some aspects that the centralised team will likely spot. I'm thinking about if there's a change in the high-risk third countries list and you've got one of those nations involved. But for the most part, it's going to be fee earners that are picking up on that, and that's why it's so important to have them not just involved, but I think engaged on an initial and an ongoing basis. I think the other key point is not just doing it, but documenting it. So I've seen a number of files over the years where clearly firms are making a good assessment and an accurate assessment of risk, but it's not documented or set out as part of a formal client matter risk assessment. So you can kind of see the outcome they've gotten to, but they can't justify their thinking. And again, I think my point stands from earlier that if something's gone wrong, the need to be able to justify that retrospectively is really important. So I think those are probably the kind of the key challenges that I see.
That's really helpful, Colette. One of the questions Joe Donger is amongst our audience today, and one of the questions he posted was, it would be interesting to understand how a centralized team get an understanding of the client without fee earners input. And I think that's kind of what you've just touched on right now about the importance of that context.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it can be done. I think it's not ideal. I think it's really quite difficult. The SRA likes to see fee earners' involvement. I think the only time it can really work is if you are doing very standardized work where there is just no difference in the matters that you're undertaking, and clients are perhaps regulated, so you're applying simplified due diligence to each of them. But I think those cases are few and far between, and I think even then you run into difficulties if you don't have fee earners alert to changes in risk profile. So I think it's a good question, but I think in pretty much all scenarios you need some amount of fee earner involvement, and I've seen different models as to how much that is, but it works best when they are engaged in the process.
Perhaps related, Colette, another question here from Allegra, who's asking, when SRA reviews our PCPs, risk assessments, etc., if you're not fully compliant but a very low risk for AML, which is essentially the type of work they do, although technically regulated, there's virtually no risk of money laundering, and there are some practices I'm sure we can think of that may fall into that category. So they're quite light touch in their approach. Looked at strictly, they feel they'll fail their inspection. But in terms of enforcement action, will it be taken into account? And I wonder if that's maybe scope for some level of standardization or centralization. What are your thoughts on Allegra's question?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's one of the areas of the regulations that is the most challenging, and I'm thinking back particularly to when the definition of tax advisor was widened, and a lot of firms that do sort of very peripheral tax advice got dragged into scope. I think the challenge is that there's sort of no de minimis on work. You're in scope or you're out, in which case you have to be compliant. That's not to say that being compliant can't be light touch. It should be appropriate to the risk that you are seeing in your clients and your matters. But there are, of course, sort of certain mandatory requirements that you need to be making sure that you're complying with, including, documenting client matter risk assessments on files, training staff, operating good policies. So light touch, yes, non-compliant, no.
Great. Thank you. Allegra, I hope that is going to answer your question. If you have any follow-ups, do let us know. Time to move into our final section. We want to try and build on some practical takeaways from what we've been discussing. And before that, we'd love to bring the audience back in with one more poll. I'm launching the right one this time. What is your biggest risk assessment challenge today? Is it engaging your fee earners, accurately rating your client and matter risk, identifying mandatory risk factors for enhanced due diligence, or consistently documenting risk assessments and having oversight of that process? Or all of the above, which some people are going for. So let's see. This one is a lot more distributed, so the results are going to be quite interesting. So I'm going to give this another 30 seconds because there's a lot more to read, digest, and respond. So it's going to be a slightly longer poll. We're nearly there, almost. 10 more seconds. Great, here we go. Let's share results. So quite equally distributed between fee earner engagement, accurate rating, and a third of our audience going for all of the above, which also I suppose is not massively surprising. Colette, Beth? Okay.
Yep, not surprised by that.
Good. Okay, let's move into the final section. And of course, part of the answer to aligning with these requirements and addressing the challenges around risk assessment is kind of the people, process, and tools, right? So technology can play a big part. And that's one of the areas that Beth, you've been looking at very, very closely. What are the benefits do you feel firms can expect, and what have you seen where technology can have the biggest impact in alleviating some of these challenges that we've just discussed, whether it's fee earners engagement or driving accurate rating. Would love for you to dive in. I believe you've got a few things to show and tell for us as well. So yeah, what would you please share what you found, what you're working on, what's the vision you've built around what we're doing here for risk assessments?
Of course, yeah, really would love to bring this to life with a view of how we're thinking at Legl to support with this. A little bit of background context for anyone who is not yet familiar with Legl's risk assessment module, which has been built in collaboration with many firms, growing number of firms now. We support firms to digitize their own risk assessment templates. So if I click into a risk assessment here, which is in progress, this is a set of sections and questions that this particular firm, Maeve Law, has identified as being necessary in order to effectively assess, in this case, client risk. So just keep that in mind, personalized to the firm, both in terms of the questions which are being asked and also in terms of the risk logic that underpins that as well. There are some really simple wins to start with from taking a more sort of technology first approach, and especially in sort of moving away from a document-based system. To start with, a very sort of live, dynamic hub of risk assessment activity. The minute a risk assessment gets started, you can see that has happened. It's possible to really collaborate on a risk assessment where that is necessary. So a system is able to pull in information that it may already have about the client, for example, your basic client details, and also looking towards things like the results of any searches which have been carried out already. So that can help to just improve the experience and make for it to feel a little less cumbersome, but also to increase the accuracy and to reduce risk of any sort of transcription errors or the need to transcribe at all in a lot of cases. Tiny wins that make a real difference, a more sort of streamlined user interface, the ability to introduce conditional logic, so that if questions are being answered in a certain way, you can ask appropriate follow-up questions. And what that helps to ensure is that the effort that's being spent on a risk assessment is relative to the risk that is being exposed as you're going through that process. Another thing also is the ability to, better not talk and try and spell all at the same time, is the ability to ensure that questions are actually being answered ahead of the risk assessment being completed. It wouldn't be possible for me to submit this without answering every question in full. And what is also so key about the sort of role in technology is that a sort of application of something like a risk policy to a job that is being carried out, i.e. a risk assessment. In this case, this firm, Maeve Law, understands what it is that may contribute to a heightened or a high risk rating. And so the fee earner here is focused on getting the right information into the risk assessment, supported by information that may be able to be pulled in from other places throughout the client onboarding journey, to the point where when they then calculate the risk rating, the risk policy is applied, in this case, AVI as a PEP. And so it sort of takes that load off of trying to understand, well, I've answered all of these questions in this way, but what does that mean for the rating of the client or the matter? Just pop in a mitigation here and mark that risk assessment as complete. And if I go back to the risk assessments table, really just quick and easy to be able to filter for things like all of your high risk client assessments in the last month, for example. The other thing I'm going to touch on, which I think is coming out time and time again, is around that sort of evidencing of ongoing monitoring and really being able to tell a story of how a how risk of a client or a matter has changed over the course of time. A risk assessment like this one, which was carried out by Jerry and then updated by Jim. If I go in, the focus here is really on not requiring someone to sort of comb through and try to understand, when did something change? Has anything changed? What's changed? To now being in a position where you can come in and see exactly when an update was made, who made it, the reason for the update, and clearly highlighted what has changed from one version to the next. So a real ability, I think, to sort of lean on the technology to do some of the heavy lifting and to take away some of the jobs which just add to the load of trying to get everything together. I think in reality, a lot of the work has already been done in terms of actually assessing risk, and this is the part of the process where you're pulling all of that information together. So where there's a way for purpose-built tools to be able to help with doing that as best as possible and to share some of that load, I think that's where there's a real opportunity to lean on those and then to focus more so on really thinking through how that risk is going to be managed moving forwards.
Amazing. Thanks, Beth. I think one of the things, having worked in the technology industry for a couple of decades now, the best part about tech is when tech almost disappears into use. And I think what comes up there for me is the notion that, going back to what we said earlier, it's not necessarily about a document or outcome. It's about that business process and how you can embed tech to allow the business process to flow smoothly, which then means that the actors can focus on what they need to do. Fee earners can engage with the risk and the assessment process properly, and the compliance teams are able to guide that. Of course, we can't do a full-blown demo, not in the time we have, as much as we would love to. Today, we wanted to focus a lot more about what is going on, but it was an opportunity for us to share some of the areas that Beth's been working on and how we are building that vision towards how we support this critical process. Colette, bringing this back to you, with the conversations you're having with the firms at the moment, and everything you shared with us about the focus of the SRA, going back to the fact that many firms perhaps aren't getting it right, and they need to get it right, and part of that is modernizing the process. Like, what is the risk of not modernizing this process to firms? Where could they find themselves in hot water if they're not moving already?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are going to be a lot of advantages to firms of having a fairly modern process in this area, and I think probably the two key ones are, we're seeing sort of an increasing requirement from the SRA for data on which they base their risk-based approach. What had initially I thought was going to be a one-off data gathering exercise is now becoming an annual data gathering exercise. And if you've got really good management information, submitting that information to the SRA on, number of high risk clients each year is going to be so much easier than if you're having to kind of go through spreadsheets and think, oh, how did I reconstruct this last year? My numbers look quite different year on year. Why is that? But I also think having really good management information internally for the purpose of assessing and managing risk is really important as well. I also think that having a really modern process is going to help you catch changes. So I've spoken a couple of times about, high risk third countries changing or people becoming PEPs. If you've got all your client matter risk assessments on Word documents, that's quite a lengthy manual process to keep up when risk factors are changing quite frequently. So I think ultimately it does save time to have a tech solution that will flag those factors to you.
Amazing. I want to try and just bring in a couple of questions that people have been posting as well before we bring this to a bit of a wrap. So please continue posting your questions. Thank you for staying with us, but I want to make sure we squeeze some of these questions in before we wrap up today. Joanna is asking, is matter or client risk assessment still necessary for regulated and or listed within an equivalent jurisdiction, given that they're deemed as low risk by regulators, wherein on simplified due diligence, oops, that just moved, where simplified due diligence is the appropriate type of due diligence?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I might pick up on another question about regulated and unregulated work. So on Joanna's question, yes, it is still required for listed clients, and I think that's because when you are dealing with listed clients, you're having to make a judgment. So firstly, is this client eligible for simplified due diligence? That's quite an easy question to answer. The second part of the question is, should I be applying simplified due diligence? So are there any other risk factors that take it outside that low risk bucket, that mean that actually relying on, listing isn't appropriate here? And it's something that I do see firms get wrong on occasion. So I've seen simplified due diligence applied, and I've looked at the matter and thought, oh, actually, this is quite high risk, and I think there needs to be further information here. I think there's quite an interesting question, which kind of goes partly to this and partly to another question about client matter risk assessments for work outside of scope of the money laundering regulations. So technically, no, if work is out of scope, you don't need to do client and matter risk assessments on them. You'll, of course, be wanting to do financial sanction checking. But the risk is, does this matter start out as outside the scope of the regulations and then passport into becoming in scope? So if you're dealing with an employment matter, if someone gives advice on tax around treatment of a payment, for example, that matter is then suddenly in scope. So if you're not doing client matter risk assessments at the outset, you need to have really good processes and really good triggers to make sure that when matters do come into scope, that you're able to do that and then apply customer due diligence. And also processes that make sure that if you're having to do full customer due diligence sort of partway through a matter, that that doesn't lead to bad outcomes for a client. So I've seen both approaches. I think both can work, but it's not a simple answer to say we're just going to do client matter risk assessments for just work in scope. There's a whole sort of framework that needs to sit alongside that to manage risk.
Yeah, and I think some of that also speaks to the fact that risk it's dynamic in nature. It's going to change. Your clients' matter circumstances could evolve, which then impacts what you do as well. And that's part of the challenge for firms as well. And that's one of the areas I know Beth's been working on. There are a couple of questions that are coming in that are quite specific about the product. I'm going to suggest that we maybe get back to you directly on some of those things because they're quite context specific as well. I'm just going to launch this in case you haven't seen our risk assessment capability and you'd like to just leave your note here, and we'll follow up with you and we can get into some of the more specific questions as well if you'd like. While we do that, Colette, there's another question coming in, which is a little bit more specific. Ideally, risk assessment should be done before matters are opened. What should be the procedure for when matters slip through the cracks and are found without a risk assessment afterwards?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions around timing. So as the questioner says, yeah, ideally you want to make sure that you do it before a matter is opened. I think where something has slipped through the cracks, I would say do it as soon as possible. And if you realise that actually you have missed getting a bit of customer due diligence information that you would have ideally liked, make sure you get that in place retrospectively. If as part of that process you form a suspicion, then of course you need to be thinking about whether or not you submit a suspicious activity report.
Amazing. Thank you, Colette. I'm slightly conscious of time. We're coming up on the hour. So what I'd love to do is if there are any pending questions we haven't addressed, we will pick them up. We'll follow them up with you separately, as well as we'll post a recording and we'll try and answer these questions via that post as well. So we'll definitely make sure they're addressed. In the meantime, just as we wrap up, Colette, Beth, I'd love to bring you both back in just to say, what is your one key takeaway from our discussion today that you think firms should be paying attention to? Can we start with you, Colette, please?
Yeah, of course. So I think document your client risk assessments as if you're in the situation where you're 5 years down the road and you've discovered that your client has become subject to an unexplained wealth order and you're having to justify your decision making retrospectively. I think if you apply that test to each of your client matter risk assessments, you won't go far wrong.
That was wonderfully succinct. Thank you, Colette. It's amazing you've managed to condense all that into that one key takeaway. That's brilliant. And Beth?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And perhaps to build on that, I think considering how you might make your risk assessment more of a sort of dynamic tool within your stack, where you're coming in to update when things have changed, or are leaning on technology to make updates when things have changed as well, just helps to ensure that you can tell a complete and realistic story over the course of time. Yeah, that's the main thing for me.
Great, thanks, Beth. And for me, listening to both of you, I think one of the biggest things that came up for me is the fact that, I've been hearing about risk assessment, getting involved and trying to understand about this process for a while now. And the notion that it's not about the document or the outcome, but it's actually a business critical process, and thinking about it from that lens was kind of the key thing that came up for me from what Colette described today, and Beth, what you've been talking about from a tech and solution point of view. So thank you both, really appreciate that. And particularly, thank you for our audience for staying with us. This is one of the longer webinars we've conducted. I really hope you're taking a lot away from this webinar and it's been useful to you. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to follow up, send it in, and we'll do our best to respond to you. And while I'm here, I've got one thing I want to plug, which is, if you haven't seen already, we just yesterday launched a state of compliance report, which my colleague Fran might be posting to a link to the channel in a minute. If not, you will get that in the follow-up email. And this is really our endeavor to gather insight data about what you're doing, what you're facing, what are some of the challenges, etc., that you as compliance peers are experiencing in the industry, and then be able to gather that and then publish it back to you. And we hope it'll then serve as a way for you to also benchmark what's happening at your firm against what's happening in the industry. And Colette's been a big part of providing input and shaping these questions along with her colleague Julia at Stratify. So we are deeply appreciative of that. And I'd be hugely appreciative of anyone that spares 5 minutes to complete it. So that's my plug. Let's wrap it up here. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. And Colette, Beth, thank you for taking your time this morning and joining us here.
Thanks
Thank you very much. Great to see everyone. Bye.